Good morning. First of all, my apologies that I'm going to give my presentation in English, but you have simultaneous translation. I shall try to speak as slowly as I can to make life a bit easier for the difficult task of translation. I would like to thank the University of Concepcion and Robinson in particular for the invitation of being here. We all like the commons. It's such a nice term, is it not? Would the world not be a fantastic, great place if we could manage collective things like water and air and atmosphere and temperatures and resources in a common way? It's so nice. It's so nice. It would be peace for everyone all the time. However, it is not that easy. It is not that simple. Now, what I want to talk about this morning is really to invite us here collectively to think a bit harder about what the commons is, what it might be, and most importantly, how commons is articulated with, related to, the process of being in common. The commons, as we know, is a socio-ecological configuration. I'll say something more about that in a moment. But that, of course, is not independent from the modalities, the procedures of being in common. The routines, the practices, the rules through which you and I live together. And of course, the modalities that decide how we are or become in common is politics. And that is what I would like to talk about a bit, because I call myself a political ecologist. Now, there are all types of political ecologists, but what I'm not is a social ecologist. That I'm not. A social ecologist is someone who considers the ways in which the non-human, or the more than human, like H2O or CO2 or other non-human things, are articulated with a variety of social relations that in their fusion of socio-physical things structure uneven social power relationships along class, gender, ethnic and other lines. That's what social ecologists do. I'm a political ecologist with the emphasis on the political, which is the particular struggle over the modalities of being in common through which socio-physical constellations like water systems come into being. So I share therefore with most other social ecologists the view that we cannot understand the world as separated into two different but interrelated things. The social is out there and the physical is on the other side, or the ecological is on the other side, and there is that a complex feedback loops. Everyone who's ever looked at the systems theory perspective knows what I'm talking about. That, of course, is nonsense. That we know today is not a accurate understanding of the world, because we do know that the world that we inhabit, our world, is a socio-physical world. It's intertwined. And that's why I've worked a lot on H2O, because H2O signals, shows, demonstrates how the social and the physical are intimately intertwined in a variety of continuously changing constellations. So in other words, I'm actually not that interested in water per se. I'm interested in the modalities through which under different political systems, the social and the physical become intertwined in very particular kind of ways. So that's why I never talk about the hydraulic or the hydrological cycle as my physical science colleagues do. That's obviously only partly true and mostly incorrect, and that therefore we should always understand the hydrological cycle as a hydrosocial cycle, in which physical, chemical, and biological processes intertwine intimately and inseparably from social and political processes. If I take a glass of water and I look at it, I cannot separate the physical molecule H2O from the rules, the regulations, the procedures through which that water becomes metabolized, changed, transformed, through which access is organized, its metabolism, its transformation is organized, and its distribution is organized. And we know that at all of these stages, these mechanisms are structured through uneven social, political, and ecological power relationships. I've tried to explore that in a number of publications that I put down here. There's one in Spanish, was published last year in Argentina, the title of which is controversially La naturaleza no existe, which is precisely making the point, that nature in and for itself, the non-human in itself, does not exist. Of course, there are trees and H2O and all sorts of non-human things. That is pretty obvious. So it's quite scandalous to say that nature does not exist. Yeah, that's exactly what I claim. And that we can only understand nature as this hybrid cosmopolitical assemblage. This by way of introduction, so you get a sense of what the political ecology tries to do. So, I and many of us have over the past few years done a lot of work on the hydrosocial cycle and its contested nature. I don't have to explore that any further. Of course, we do know that within the hydrosocial circulation there is extraordinary conflict and contestation. Much of it, as we heard earlier, has nothing to do with the assumed physical characteristics of H2O. When we say that water is scarce, we should stop saying that. Leave that to our enemies. It's always the elites that say that water is scarce. You and I know that this is a lie. Yeah, I'm a geographer, right? And one of the most abundant things on Earth is H2O. We know that geographically it might be, it is unevenly distributed, but it does not take a genius to get waters from A to B. And to get some dirty to clean. Any idiot can do that, actually. Getting people to the moon, that's difficult. Yet distributing the abundant waters of the earth is a piece of cake, actually. We can do that. We've also, for years now, and I think we've reached the limits of that, understood or thought about water as articulated in the tension between private, particularly in the context of privatization, neoliberalization, etc., to which the opposite political imaginary was public. Now, in a context of pervasive neoliberalization, that has become problematic. Yeah? Take Chile as an example. No. If water becomes the domain of the state, look at what the state does. And that's not just the case in Chile. The state in most places, not everywhere, and it's very heterogeneous and geographically unevenly organized, but most states, either at the local or the regional or the national level, are now neoliberal states. Do not forget that, again, not fall into the fantasy of neoliberal or neoclassical economists, that neoliberalism is about the private organization of the economy through market mechanism. Yes, that's true. But who does it? Who makes that possible? It's the state. So today there's nothing any longer we can do with the state, because the state today has become the executive political class of private capital, in the way in which Marx put it in the late 19th century, which in the 20th century became a bit more complicated with the rise of the social democratic state, etc., things became articulated in different ways. Today, that's not any longer the case, right? The state doesn't lie about it any longer either. The state has become today the executive, the branch, as Marx put it in the 19th century, of the market economy, of capitalism, and they do not even lie about it. We don't need an ideology to critique anymore, because most states quite explicitly and clearly state that that is what they want to do. So that makes our situation a bit more complicated, yeah? Because it's not any longer about just a fight against privatization and making sure that the collective common configurations are part of the public understood as the state. It's of course in that context that the common, or the commons, has arisen as a sort of third way. But what I'm really concerned with is what exactly is this thing called the commons? A, and B, how does the thing called the commons, which is in itself highly contested and contentious, articulated with different political projects? Right? So I would argue that we have today a profound process of a neoliberalizing commons, which stands very much against the sort of indigenous commons we heard about earlier, but which all are commons too. Just to illustrate what I mean is, in 2010, there was a major international financial crisis, right? Which certainly in the US and in Europe, I don't know about Latin America, brought the international financial capitalist system to the edge of a structural systemic crisis. They were shitting it, right? The international financial system was on the verge of disintegration, of collapse, right? What happened? Well, we mobilized $3.5 trillion worldwide commons, bringing together collectively $3.5 trillion. If we add it all up, what we did in Europe and what the Americans did and others did around the world, it's not difficult to add up, look at the statistics and the data. This is commoning. This is the mobilization of the commons to produce socialism of a particular kind. It was a socialism of the elites. It's only thanks to this process of commoning, of socialist but elite commoning, that the international financial elite succeeded in saving itself, thanks to our money, our capital, our means. That's a form of commoning too, and very successfully so. Yeah. So don't think that commoning and mobilizing the commons is only the prerogative of those that we like the post-colonial people, the weak, the disempowered, etc. It ain't. And that turns it into a bitter and lethal fight. It ain't nice what's going on out there, and that's what I would like to explore a bit further. All right, my talk's not going to be very coherent in certain ways. It's just like to think through some of the inconsistencies, issues, and difficulties that we really should think about hard, really hard, if you want to articulate a political imaginary around the commons. So first, what is it not? It's always easier to start from the negative. So the commons is not necessarily that what is opposed to the private. As I said earlier, the state or many public institutions operate along a private reasoning. So I prefer Kant's distinction between private reasoning and public reasoning, which should not be confused with private organization and public organization, because as we know today, most public institutions mobilize a private reasoning. That is a reasoning that does not fully include the heterogeneous totality of the collective, but nurtures and functions in name of, in the interest of a particular set of groups, a private reasoning. So the commons is certainly not necessarily that what is public in the sense of state control. Also, it's not a public good in the sense in which economists talk about a public good. And as I already tried to indicate, it is not essentially or fundamentally and inevitably normatively good. It can be really bad. As I've already indicated, that it is a serious struggle over commoning by the elites. That's why they're so bloody successful in overtaking most of the ways in which we try to organize our lives. But also as a thing, as a socio-ecological configuration, it's not always normatively good. You know, we think about water, yes, water is good, it's important, it's essential, it's vital, right? But think about CO2 in the atmosphere. They're the kind of thing that is contributing to the fact that we're going to fry to death over the next 50 or 60 years. That's what commons do. Right? The atmosphere is what commons do, including the CO2 that is piling up too fast in it. But think about waste, garbage. That's what commons do. And it is over these commons, which are usually thought about as negative externalities, to use the kind of economist language, which we, of course, do not want to use, should be understood as a commons too. And the associated struggles of appropriation, enclosure, exclusion, the privatization, the commodification, that's precisely what in Bonn they're trying to do without any success, of course, is to privatize the commons of carbon. We call it carbon offsetting. The clean development mechanism is nothing else than a form of enclosing the atmosphere, privatizing the commons of CO2, and then dumping it somewhere else, as the clean development mechanism does. So what is it then? Well, it is a process. That means that it's not just a thing. What constitutes the common, and if we think of it as political or social ecologists as something that is inherently social and physical, it's something that's continuously changing, continuously transforming. It's a terrain that is also continuously contested, struggled over. And of course, it is one of the key configurations to make a particular type of profit. I've often asked myself, why is it that subaltern social strategies and movements over the past 10 or 15 years have been articulating so much around this notion of the commons? Why now? Why for 30, 40, 50, 60 years in the 20th century most social struggles was articulated around the class and gender, and now it's the commons and a socio-ecological configuration. Why? And I would argue that that is deeply, deeply interconnected with the particular key dynamics of capitalism today. Today's capitalism is much more, certainly in places like Chile and others in the global north, much more articulated around what Marxists would call rent extraction. Rent extraction. The privatization is nothing else than the process through which ownership is established, which then permits, on the exclusive basis of ownership, to extract money from someone else for the use of that. So I would argue that today the socio-ecological commons have become a key, vital and central pivot to sustain the global capital circulation process. Right? There's no difference, therefore, between mining extractivism, which you're all familiar with in this country, and water. It's exactly the same mechanism, exactly the same process. And it's predicated upon the rent and rent extraction, which of course what the basis of private property is. It is to make sure that there is a monopoly and exclusive control over something to do what? So that you can extract value from someone else for him or her to be able to use that. That is the whole basis, of course, of rent is very different from the way in which surplus is produced through a production year process. Something completely different. There's extra value, surplus value is produced. Not so with the exploitation of the commons. Okay. So, let me say a bit more now about what the commons is. So for me, the commons is a collective historical, geographical product and process. There's nothing essential about it. So they refer fundamentally to the socio-ecological constellations and collectively transformed or metabolized, the word I prefer to use, socio-ecological relations and configurations, such as water constellations, air constellations. So our atmosphere is a produced atmosphere, as we know full well. There's nothing given about it. It's an organic machine of which we are co-constituting its characteristics, and the same is true for the hydrosocial cycle. CO2, waste, gene and other codes, like software codes, the result of the collective intellect. If I buy a software package, I don't just buy a product, I buy a rent to the privatized collective intelligence that has produced that code. Knowledge, information, learning. Learning is the greatest commons, of course. We always stand on the shoulders of those who went before us. We appropriate and flee to then now sell it to the highest bidder in the marketplace. The privatization of higher education is nothing else than the privatization of the commons. Yeah, that's why I'm not particularly interested in water. We should take water as a pivotal example of a much wider, pervasive year process. Affective labels. Ever notice when you walk into Starbucks how those who serve you smile the whole time? How they're so nice to you the whole time? How are you this morning? Do you have a nice day? That's affective labor. That is privatizing and appropriating someone's deepest emotions. We're going to fire you if you do not laugh, if you do not smile, if you do not wish your customers a nice day. There's the commons of affective labor. Biodiversity, the regimes, eco-services, resources, urban spaces, of course, the greatest collective urban, the greatest commons. Collective urban space, which is being privatized, and the urban space. And there's no difference between the privatization of urban space and the privatization of water. It has different social, ecological consequences, the same mechanism. So the commons are socio-ecological arrangements and their power-laden regulatory conditions of the right of use, right of transformation, right of access, and the modalities of distribution. And these are, of course, the axes around which the struggle over the commons unfolds. And that struggle is one about the processes of being in common, because they hang together, the modalities of being in common and the way in which access, transformation, and distribution of the commons is organized. So let's think for a moment about being in common as distinct but articulated with the commons. So being in common is the modalities through which we manage the commons. When we do that in democratic ways, this is the name that has now become hegemonic. Right, with all Democrats now, and after the death of socialism, with all Democrats now. So a democratic being in common concerns, in theory, the mode of collective production and reproduction, and therefore the management of the commons around the presumption of equality of each and all. How often do we think about the democratic as the management of the commons under the presumption of the equality of each and all. While we know full well that every democrat actually exists in democratic institutions, that some are much more equal than others. I was thinking a bit about your presidential candidate, the front runner. Now, he is a lot less, you and I are much less equal than he is, for the variety of reasons that we know. So neoliberalization is in fact nothing else than a manifestation of the animal foreign politics under which we live. That in principle, yes, we're all equal, but some are much more equal than others. You remember the story of the pigs and the horse in George Orwell's novel? So I would argue that we should think of neoliberalization as a political project. Not just an economic one, it's a political agenda, a political project. This is a process of elite commoning, whereby the mission, and they sometimes succeed, sometimes do not, in constructing socialism for the elites. And this is actually not me saying this. I didn't bring the slide with me, but a few years back, Newsweek, the US weekly news magazine, which can never be accused of very radical or mildly radical views, put on its front cover, "We are all socialists now." We are all socialists now, which sounds a bit odd for the kind of right of center journal. What they meant, of course, was, this was 2010, 2011, that the public configuration of the state is perfectly happy to mobilize whatever they can collectively mobilize in order to make sure that the socio-economic order that we have, neoliberalism, can continue for a while longer. So what is happening today under neoliberalism is mobilizing the commons for the few. As we know, the process of, say, privatizing water is not easy, actually. It's not easy at all. You have to bring together political forces of a particular kind, economic forces of a particular kind, a discursive apparatus of a particular kind, a physical geographical configuration, a technological structure of a particular kind, and that has to be brought together in order for a privatized water system, let's say, to operate. This is a gigantic common enterprise. It's a collective common enterprise. So the commons, the struggle for the commons is not just one of the people that we like. There's the poor, the disempowered, etc. The poor, the struggle of the poor, the disempowered, disenfranchised over the commons is a struggle they always lose. That's why they're poor, disenfranchised and marginalized. And this is today becoming really global. I mean, many of you are familiar with the notion of anthropocene, the notion that says that we humans are now co-responsible for co-constituting the Earth's deep geological time, right? Not just dabbling with the troposphere, but deep geological climatic dynamics. We co-produce them. Question is, who is going to produce that kind of commons for whose interest? So this is really quite a acute situation that we're in. So furthermore, let's think a bit harder about the commons as a theoretical construct on the one hand, but also as a historical construct. Where does it come from? How was it used? How did it exist in the past? So, for example, when I heard saying earlier that Spain, in its colonial mission, introduced particular forms of social and political organization under imperial and colonial rule, absolutely true, except that it was not Spain. It was a tiny Spanish elite who was doing that. 90% of the Spanish population were poor, marginalized peasants, indigenous peasants, living on the commons of Spain's land. If you want to know about it, take my book on Spain. Right? Most Spaniards had absolutely nothing to do with imperial conquest and colonial extraction and the cultures associated with that. In fact, they were as much subject to the pervasive subsequent processes of privatization, dispossession, and cultural transformation as Latin American indigenous. I know that does not sound PC these days, but I think it's really important that it's not just the struggle of the colonial versus the post-colonial people, but that within the colonizing empires, that was deeply split too. 80% of the Spaniards were dying of hunger, while the Spanish elite was imposing its rule on places like Latin America and elsewhere. I think it's really important to remember that. So the commons historically, certainly during the medieval periods in Europe, and it is a bit Eurocentric possibly what I'm saying here, is that the commons were always the remainder, the excess, the surplus of feudal relations of production and reproduction. It is that what the feudal lords did not want, or what they left to their serfs for use. After they had hunted the forest, the serfs could go in and use the commons to pick mushrooms and get some rabbits. So that is the origin, certainly in Europe, of the name of the commons. It was indeed a place where the peasants and the serfs eked out a complex but simple and poor reproduction. And these commons were very much structured through feudal power relationships, right? Where the feudal elites controlled, not ownership in the capitalist sense, but controlled the dominion of the prime lands. So the commons, historically, and I think today still are the leftovers. So should we be content in our struggle for indigenous rights, etc., important as they are, be content with the struggle over what the elites are willing to left over for the others? I don't think so. So the commons has indeed historically been a big problem for capital, for the making of capitalism, and still is today. That's why such an enormous battle unfolds over it the whole time. Not just the commons of the peasants and the serfs, but also the commons of the feudal lords, their commons. So the possibility for this continuing self-expansion of capital is not just predicated upon capitalist social relations of production and factors, the kind of stuff that standard mainstream Marxists focus on, but is also very much based upon the continuous process, as David Harvey pointed out systematically, the continuous process of accumulation by dispossession. Primitive accumulation in the original Marxist version, but it's not so primitive at all. It's an ongoing, continuing process of enclosing that what is not private, and through enclosing, generating exclusive monopoly rights, which permits then a very particular type of accumulation. And it's not accumulation of economic growth to the production of new values, to the mobilization of labor force, it's extracting rent. And of course, struggling over the enclosures over the course of the past 30 years or so has indeed become a vital tactic of global capital in a condition in which the traditional forms of expansion of capital, the value production process, has become much more difficult. I'd rather be a landowner than someone who tries to invent a new high-tech gadget. I'd rather be a big urban landowner in Amsterdam or Manchester or Santiago than try to invest in a competitive and difficult sort of process. I'll rather put my shares in coltan or water or CO2, if need be. It's a much more secure form of land extraction. So what we have today, I think, is that much, not all, but much of the dynamics of capital, what some have called the new culture of capitalism, articulates around the privatization of the new and the old commons, and is articulated around the land extraction. It's a form of parasitic capitalism, where you take from someone and not to appropriate it yourself. Yes, these are commons leeches, as someone put it. It's like bloodsuckers. Leeches. It's very, very different from the industrial form of capital. And it's in that context, I think, where capitalism has become much more parasitic on common resources as a modality to make profit, that accounts for the fact that so much social struggle and social movements today articulate precisely around this condition. Not any longer just the capital-labor relationship that unions and others do, that still matters, but it's not any longer central anymore. Everyone of us talks about the commons, and social movement is fighting over the commons. Why? Well, precisely because that is indeed one of the key pivots today for the way in which capitalism operates, and explains why this has become such a key nexus of class struggle of a particular kind. Yeah, I'll skip this. Just a few comments I wanted to make. How indeed commoning has become one of the key moments of the new culture of capitalism, as Boltanski so eloquently put it not that long ago. So this is the source, the new commons, and its appropriation as a new sort of land extraction, which articulates quite well with the process of financialization. As we all know, financialization is not just an abstract, the process of money floating around a fictitious capital circulation, which it is, in a certain way, but which of course always predicated upon some sort of material base, right? It's no surprise that we said in 2010 that the financial crisis was one of toxic mortgages. Newspapers say it exactly right, correct, right? But the same is of course true for other common resources, like mines, water, land, etc. And that's why so much struggle unfolds over the privatization of the environmental commons. So it's not just water, also gene pools. Whose genes do you have in your body? Is it yours or someone else's? Of CO2, minerals, rare earths like coltan, garbage. I'm doing quite a lot of work today with garbage and the enclosure of garbage in African cities, whereby access to waste has become impossible for some of the poorest segments of the urban population, whose very survival is predicated upon having access to the commons of garbage. And which is now sealed off to turn it into rent in the context of financialized waste capitalism. So it's an argument similar to the water argument. It can also be seen, of course, in what some have called accumulation by contamination and accumulation by decarbonization, the carbon offset system. And has extended now to some of the most affective conditions of life. Think of the affective service economy. Think of the gendering that takes place in the commodification appropriation of childcare. One of the greatest commons on earth, childcare, and its affective appropriation. Who is not paying for childcare for their kids if they have children? See what I mean? Of course, these new forms of elite commoning do meet indeed with all manner of alternative, politicizing forms, strategies, and imaginaries of commoning. And as I said, it is one of the key contradictions today. In that process, new political subjects are being formed. So someone raised earlier, you did, Robinson, the question of political subjectivation. Right? Who are those who put their bodies on the line, who become political subjects in a politicizing struggle? That's what Foucault means by subjectivation. It's the moment that people give up, do not any longer want to be objects of governing, that is, do what they're supposed to do because that is what is expected of them, and become subjects of their lives. That, fuck that, I'm not going to do that, I'm going to do something else. Yeah? And become a political subject. If we consider in the worldwide heterogeneous struggles of the new social movements, don't like that word social movements too much, but anyway, if we look at the composition of the agents who participate, who become subjects, they're a bit odd, huh? They're a bit odd. They're not any longer the privileged political subject of our emancipatory theories of the 20th century. The proletariat for the Marxists, woman for the feminists, the subalterns for the post-colonialists. What we do find in those mobilizations is a strange mix of all of them. Workers and intellectuals, indigenous people and white dominant people too. Some of them at least. They join up. Old and young. Kind of strange configuration of those who join up despite their very different social and cultural positionalities in an oppositional battle. And that should make us think about the nature of political emancipatory, transformative, yet political struggle today. Who are they or we who engage in that kind of thing? It became clear to me in the uprisings of 2011, 2012, 2013 in our big cities worldwide. And if you look at the social composition of those, that's a strange bunch of people, you know? That I could not any longer easily categorize within my standard theories of who the privileged social agents of change are. So we should think about that, because the commons, the struggle over the commons, re-articulates, redefines who the subjects of change are. Secondly, if I look at the subaltern movements fighting for the new commons, is that they question, if not radically undermine, the key vectors and agents around which emancipatory struggle was fought in the 19th and 20th century. In the 19th and 20th century, the key agents were labor in contingent articulation with other forces, but labor is one of the key axes that was organized in a polity, a hierarchical political polity, and that would fight for the state. So these were the things you would do. Yeah? A subject, a form of organization, and a battlefield. None of those three axes are still performative today. And you can see how the new political movements articulating around the commons are struggling with that. Yeah? Not just asking, who are we, but how do we organize? They want to get away from the traditional party form, but they have no bloody idea how to do it, and I don't have either, so we should think a bit about that. How to organize. And what to fight over. Is occupying the state, the alpha and the omega? Well, no, it isn't. It requires the local socio-ecological configuration, the regional one, the state too, and we have to think about the transnational configurations too, right? Like Mercosur, and how that articulates with it. And whether the free trade agreement is going to accept a real commons of water. Good luck. So we find the emergence of heterogeneous new subjects that fight for new forms of being in common and around which new terrains of struggle unfold. And I think we really have to think a bit harder about that than we do at the moment. So let me conclude. Is the struggle for a new commons that is not just the struggle of the socialist elites for the neoliberal commons, not a call for thinking about a communist politics? To play a bit on words here, because I don't dare to use communist politics in this kind of context. But why not call it a communist politics? That doesn't have the weight of the past so heavily weighing on one's shoulders. But that's in fact, I think, what we need to think to. What is the proper communist politics, ways of being in common, in order to construct a radically inclusive, democratic commons? So there are a number of terrains, and I can think of at least a few hundred PhDs that could be done on this, rather than do yet another analysis of how neoliberalism fucks up people. We know that. I don't want to say another PhD on that. I don't. We know everything about this. Now, let's think something new, and particularly for the young people who are still struggling about thinking about what they're going to do the PhD on. Here are a few suggestions. Rethinking past forms of comedy, and to see how they articulate with present forms of comedy. To get away from the hopelessly romantic view I often see repeated and repeated in current struggles, etc. There is nothing romantic about it. It's a hard battle and can take very different forms and very different conditions, and not all of them remotely the progressive, which are the progressive, inclusive, egalitarian forms of comedy, and which are not. Also, of course, the critique of the dominant socioeconomic theories around the commons. Most of you are familiar, of course, with Hardin's tragedy of the commons. Each time you mention the commons, you get the tragedy of the commons thrown in your face. Right? It shows that the common organization, according to Harding's rational choice argument, will necessarily lead to tragedy. Right? And no one, or very few people, point out that although Hardin's reasoning is impeccable, absolutely impeccable in his wonderfully coherent rational choice unfolding, but let's consider his assumptions just for one moment. What does Hardin assume? That the cows that are going to use the common pastures are private, and the pasture land is common. This is asymmetrical starting conditions. Private ownership of cows, public common structuring of pasture lands. Of course you're going to get a mess. The treasure of the commons disappears. As snow for the sun at the moment you assume that the cows are common too. When the cows are common too, then you need, in your rational choice argument, you need to have some sort of institutional configuration to organize the modalities of access and distribution. Right? But not necessarily a tragedy. Where are the critiques of those who critique our views and our desire to have a commons? Because most of those critiques, not all, but most of those critiques, despite the fact that highly intelligent, are wrong. Given that we cannot any longer put our faith in the state, good luck with your state over the next few years. Since we cannot put our faith in the state anymore, we should start thinking about different ways of democratic organization in parallel to the existing state forms. We're not going to do away with the state. I'm not. And how do we reclaim a democratic organization of the commons? And forgive me if I'm a bit provocative again, but some of the indigenous communities that I've worked with in Ecuador, they are not very democratic, inclusive, or egalitarian for that matter. Some are, others are not. They are widely heterogeneous and divergent. And if you look at the gender and other class-type relationships within these indigenous communities, we should take them seriously too. So what does it mean to be equal? How do we affirm equal forms of self-organization and common stewardship? How do we nurture dissensus and deal with disagreements on an egalitarian basis. And how? This is the most difficult. This is the most difficult thing. Most movements don't become or tolerated, actually, except when they started to become successful. As long they are rituals of resistance, some anthropologists call them, they're not only accepted, they're applauded. Neoliberal culture lets 1,000 flowers bloom, and if you want to be different, right? If you want to express your cultural difference, of course, that just shows how inclusive and tolerant neoliberal culture is. Of course, the story changes at the moment that some of those movements become politically performative. That is the moment they might begin to have an effect. That means challenge the dominant, hegemonic form. What do these movements then invariably are confronted with? Violence. Time after time again, historically and in the present time, right? As long they are just expressions of different cultures, fine. And when they become politicizing and begin to have some minimal effect, violence will be their part. How do we respond to that violence? It's nice to be jotted in a kind of commons of scholarship, of academia, etc. And we should be, of course. But how do we confront the inevitability of violence by those who will, by all means possible, make sure that their politics of commoning will prevail? I don't have any answer, but a few PhDs on that would be useful. So, and most importantly, that's my final statement, I think at the beginning of the 21st century, when indeed these new forms of social struggle and political struggle unfold very much around the question of the commons, as I tried to indicate. Although the struggle still matters, and I don't want to give up on the standard, the class struggle, but the kind of struggle over the commons, what the commons is, etc., nuclear place, etc., is absolutely vital. Right? So our challenge for the 21st century is for me the following. Either we mobilize the best of our humanitarian capacities, and they are considerable, right, to shave off the roughest part of the continuous process of privatization of the commons and the inclusion of the exclusion of the most vulnerable from that. And we try to help them as much as we can. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that. You know, let's be humanitarian managers. Or we can fight for a different political commons imaginary, which is fighting around a different political project of being in common. So the question is, do we believe really in the communist hypothesis, that is, a more common, democratic, inclusive world is possible, or do we not? And are just good people in a difficult world?